Hey guys, tonight we're taking a little detour through history to a time where togas were a thing and your average person's idea of a great night was debating philosophy or watching a bunch of men in sandals wrestling in oil. Welcome to ancient Greece. So get comfy, maybe dim the lights if you're in that kind of mood, because you're about to drift off to sleep while I tell you all about how life was in ancient Greece. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all golden statues and elegant temples. In fact, life in ancient Greece had some seriously weird quirks. And no, I'm not just talking about the gods throwing temper tantrums like petulant toddlers. I'm talking about the everyday lives of regular people, or at least regular-ish people, like those that could afford fancy statues and a nice marble bath. But before we dive into all of this, let's set the scene. Ancient Greece was around for hundreds of years, so the specifics change a bit depending on whether we're talking about, say, the 5th century BC or the 4th century BC. But one thing remained consistent. It was a place where the politics were as messy as a toddler's birthday party, and God spent way too much time messing with mortals who probably just wanted to have some olives in peace. Okay, let's float over to the early days of Greece to get an idea of how things were really going for the average Greek person. And by average Greek, I mostly mean the rich because, well, we're talking about ancient Greece. Things weren't exactly democratic for the entire population. The majority of people lived on the outskirts of town or in the countryside, working hard in the fields or grinding away at whatever trade they could find. But of course, the rich people are the ones we're most concerned with because, let's be honest, they're the ones with the weirdest problems. The first thing you need to know about ancient Greece is that society was very stratified, which is a fancy way of saying that there were a lot of people at the top who didn't really care about the people at the bottom. At the top of this pyramid, you had the aristocrats, the philosophers, and the generals, all those people who probably spent their days discussing how great they were while sipping wine made from grapes that were definitely crushed by the feet of slaves. But let's talk about some of those elite folk. Take, for instance, the famous Athenian general Pericles. He's this grand, commanding figure, the guy who led Athens during its golden age and probably thought he was just too important to hang out with the average citizen. Pericles might have had a reputation for being a smooth operator in politics, but his personal life, not so much. See, he was married to a woman named Aspasia, and there's this constant debate about whether or not she was a mistress or a real wife. Some people think she was just a smart, independent woman who probably had a much better grasp on Athenian politics than Pericles himself. But we'll never know for sure because history doesn't like to be clear about things. What we do know is that Pericles was so enamored with her that when she wasn't around, he'd write her really long, probably over-complimentary letters. Because nothing says, "I respect you as an equal," like passive-aggressive note writing, right? Then there's the whole issue of Pericles' other relationships. He had a habit of marrying his children off to high-profile families, which, surprise, was a pretty standard move for the ancient elite. Marriages were more about securing power than they were about love or, anything resembling a healthy relationship. Imagine being one of Pericles' children, waking up one day to find your parent has arranged for your future spouse to be some random political figure's son. That would probably feel a little off. Like, hey, Dad, I didn't ask for this life, but also, ancient Greece and all. Moving on, let's talk about the city-states for a moment. Ancient Greece wasn't some unified empire or anything fancy like that. No. Each city-state was basically its own mini-country with its own laws and rulers. Athens, where Pericles came from, was famous for being the birthplace of democracy. But like most democracies, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. See, the citizens who had the right to vote were only adult men. So, sorry, ladies and slaves, no vote for you. But hey, at least you could be part of the public forums where they discussed things like philosophy and politics, if you were one of the lucky few. And sure, if you didn't agree with what they were saying, you could just keep your head down. Or, get sentenced to death for making the wrong argument. Totally chill. Speaking of those forums, let's take a quick detour and talk about the life of an average philosopher in ancient Greece. These guys were basically the influencers of their time, just without the sponsored posts. One famous figure you've probably heard of is Socrates, who famously didn't write anything down, so our understanding of him mostly comes from his students, particularly Plato. Socrates was kind of an oddball. The guy didn't believe in making any money off his philosophy, which in a way makes him the ultimate hipster. He'd go around Athens barefoot, because why wear shoes when you're dropping truth bombs, right? And have long, annoying conversations with people. He'd ask questions like, "What is virtue?" Or, "Do you think you're really smart?" and just let people dig themselves into a hole of confusion. He was the ancient Greek version of someone who comments "actually" under every post on Twitter. Super fun at parties, I'm sure. But let's be real for a second. Socrates was a bit too extreme for most of Athens. The man didn't play by the rules, and this, of course, led to his trial and eventual death. His crime? Corrupting the youth, which sounds pretty standard for anyone trying to change the status quo, but it's also kind of funny when you think about it. Like, the people of Athens were so worried that asking too many questions would cause societal collapse that they decided, you know what, let's just have this guy executed. So they did. That was the solution to philosophical discussions. But hey, what does ancient Greece even mean if not a whole bunch of irony? A place full of people who thought they were inventing democracy while also kind of sticking it to everyone who didn't have power. They had gods who loved to mess with them, philosophers who got executed for asking questions, and a whole lot of wine-soaked debates that likely didn't solve much of anything. As we continue our journey through ancient Greece, just know if you find yourself thinking, "Why is everyone so obsessed with power and status?" you're not alone. It's not like things have changed much, right? Let's float over to another royal disaster. All right, now that we've set the stage, let's dive deeper into the lives of some of the more eccentric characters in ancient Greek society. Specifically, those who were lucky enough to be born with the magic combination of royal blood and absolute power. Spoiler, it didn't always work out as planned. Now, you might be imagining a Greek king, someone with a grand, regal crown, a sprawling palace, and possibly a toga that never gets dirty. In reality, Greek royalty wasn't all that glamorous, and honestly, the lives of kings and queens were about as chaotic as trying to keep a flock of goats from eating the sacred temple offerings. It was all politics, bad decisions, and really questionable family dynamics. Let's start with one of the most famous and least competent Greek kings, King Agamemnon. Now, you've probably heard of him because of the whole Trojan War thing. He was the big cheese who led the Greek forces against Troy. But in terms of being a good leader, yeah, not so much. Agamemnon's story is essentially a textbook example of how not to lead a kingdom. It all starts with a really bad family vacation. Agamemnon had a beautiful wife named Clytemnestra, but here's the thing. He made the hugely questionable decision to sacrifice their daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods in order to get favorable winds for his ships. You know, because what says good parenting like killing your kid to go to war? Of course, Clytemnestra wasn't exactly thrilled with this arrangement. She probably wasn't thinking, yes, this is a reasonable thing to do. More like, okay, I'm definitely getting revenge on you when you get back. And lo and behold, when Agamemnon eventually returns home from Troy, Clytemnestra is waiting for him with a very special welcome home gift, a dagger. Yes, she killed him. And why? Because apparently, if you sacrifice your daughter for war, you're not winning any Spouse of the Year awards. But the best part, Agamemnon's death didn't even end the family drama. Oh no. His son, Orestes, later returns and seeks vengeance for his father's death by killing his mother, Clytemnestra. So, in case you're wondering, the ancient Greeks didn't have family reunions, they just had more murders. Seriously, being part of the royal family in ancient Greece was like being cursed by a never-ending loop of bad decisions and revenge plots. Moving on, let's float over to another royal family with questionable life choices, the House of Atreus. This family is like the Greek version of the never-ending tragedy. Everything they touched turned into a mess. Let me just list a few highlights. One of the guys, Tantalus, decided it would be a great idea to serve his son, Pelops, to the gods as a meal. Why? Who knows? Maybe he thought it would be a good bonding experience. Anyway, the gods figured out the trick, and as punishment, Tantalus was stuck in the underworld forever, standing in a pool of water with fruit hanging above him, except whenever he tried to drink the water or grab the fruit, they would always recede just out of reach. Classic ancient Greek punishment, honestly. When life gives you a pool of water, you can't drink it. But let's return to the royals who didn't go full cannibal. You've got these Greek kings who are constantly in power struggles, plotting and scheming. Here's the thing though, most of these kings were more about impressing other people with their wealth and status than actually ruling well. Take the kings of Macedon, for example. One of the most famous kings was Philip II, who's kind of the OG power-hungry ruler, laying the groundwork for his son, Alexander the Great. But Philip's life was a bit of a soap opera. Sure, he united most of the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule, but let's talk about how he did it. For one, he was married 7 times. Yes, 7. And that's not even including his mistresses, because ancient Greek royalty didn't do monogamy. They were more about alliances through marriage, and each wife was basically a strategic move in the game of power. But the really dramatic bit is that his last wife, Cleopatra, not the Egyptian one, this is just another Cleopatra because apparently that name was a royal favorite, was almost certainly the reason Philip's son, Alexander, eventually had his dad killed. Not a great family dynamic, but also totally on brand for ancient Greece. I mean, how could you not want to be part of that drama? Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer most of the known world, was basically raised in a home where political power was a game, family bonds were fleeting, and nothing was ever really settled. Maybe that's why he was so motivated to be the best. Who wouldn't want to leave their crazy family behind and take over everything? Alexander had a bit of a reputation for being reckless, but let's be real. Most of his successes probably came from the fact that he was the most dedicated to making sure no one else was around to challenge him. You know, just wipe out anyone in your way, and suddenly you're the guy who's remembered for centuries. Talk about long-term thinking. Okay, but let's rewind for a second and talk about the more messed up side of these royal families. You see, when you live in a time where everyone's related to each other through marriage alliances and power grabs, it's easy for things to get genetically complicated. You've heard of royal inbreeding, right? Well, ancient Greece wasn't exactly the place for diversity in family trees. It was all about keeping the bloodline pure, or at least as pure as you could manage, while literally marrying your sister, niece, or some other close relative. Nothing says dynastic stability than a couple of cousins getting hitched and hoping for the best. Spoiler alert, it didn't always turn out well. Take the infamous Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. While we're not talking about pure Greek royalty here, these guys were pretty much the equivalent of Greek royalty adjacent. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt after Alexander's death, were famous for their extensive inbreeding. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, not the one who married Philip II, was the product of at least 5 generations of her family marrying each other. Not surprisingly, this resulted in some serious mental and physical problems for her children, but hey, they managed to get by. But can you imagine? Every time a new Ptolemaic ruler came into power, it was like a genetic lottery, and more often than not, the results were less than ideal. So yeah, the royals weren't exactly winning Best Family Ever awards. But hey, they were still royal. They had power, they had wealth, and they had all the drama that comes with it, which, in ancient Greece, was kind of the point, wasn't it? And as we drift into the next segment of this cozy history lesson, remember that ancient Greek royals may have lived in marble palaces, but they were hardly immune to the same kinds of human messiness we all encounter today. Power, politics, and family drama. It's all timeless. Now, let's drift over to the next royal disaster, shall we? All right, let's gently drift away from royal murder spirals and dynastic nonsense for a bit and talk about the average experience of life in ancient Greece. And when I say average, I mean not a king, not a general, and definitely not a god. Just regular people. Regular, tired, sandaled people. Because for most Greeks, life wasn't about philosophy debates or dramatic betrayals in marble palaces. It was about getting up early, dealing with the heat, hoping the olives didn't fail this year, and trying not to offend anyone important enough to ruin your life. So, relatable. Let's start with daily life for men, since ancient sources are obsessed with them and mostly ignore everyone else. A free adult male citizen in a place like Athens had one main job: participate. Participate in politics, in war when necessary, in debates, and very importantly, in judging everyone else. This was a society built on opinions, loud ones. An Athenian man would wake up early, usually at dawn because sleeping in was not exactly a cultural value. He'd grab some bread, maybe dip it in wine because water alone was suspicious, and then head out. If he was wealthy, he might spend his mornings supervising slaves who did the actual work. If he was less wealthy, he was the work. Farming, crafting, trading in the marketplace. All very glamorous, very dusty. The agora, or marketplace, was the heart of the city. Imagine a mix between a farmer's market, a political rally, and a place where someone is always yelling about something. This was where you bought food, argued about laws, listened to philosophers talk at you, and probably ran into someone you didn't want to see. Athens was not subtle. Now, let's gently pivot to women who, despite making up half the population, were treated like a sort of background feature. In Athens especially, women were expected to stay indoors as much as possible. Respectable women didn't go out alone. Their main responsibilities were managing the household, producing legitimate children, and staying out of trouble. And by trouble, I mean literally anything involving independence. Marriage for Greek women usually happened young, like very young. A girl might be married in her early teens to a man in his 30s. Romantic, right? These marriages were arranged, and the bride's opinion was not required. The goal was heirs. Love was optional and generally not expected. Once married, a woman's world became the household. She supervised slaves, managed food stores, wove cloth, and raised children. A lot of weaving. So much weaving. Greek literature loves to mention women weaving, possibly because it was the safest activity they could imagine for them. And honestly, it was probably exhausting. No wonder mythology is full of women who snap and turn into spiders or something. But here's the thing. Despite all this restriction, women weren't powerless. They controlled the household economy, raised the next generation, and sometimes quietly influenced their husbands, especially in elite families. You don't survive ancient politics without picking up a few manipulation skills along the way. Now, Sparta. Ah, yes, because of course, Sparta had to be different. Spartan society was basically the anti-Athens. Where Athens loved talking, Sparta loved training. From birth, literally. Spartan babies were inspected, and if they were deemed weak, let's just say Sparta was not big on second chances. The goal was strength. Always strength. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and placed into military training programs called the agoge. This was less school and more survival boot camp. They were taught to fight, endure pain, and obey orders. Comfort was considered suspicious. Hunger was normal. Shoes were optional. Empathy was discouraged. Spartan girls, however, had a very different experience from Athenian women. They were encouraged to exercise, train, and be physically strong. The idea was that strong women would produce strong warriors. Romance, not really the focus. Spartan women had more freedom, more education, and more control over property than their Athenian counterparts, which probably made Athenian men extremely uncomfortable. And honestly, Spartan women seemed to enjoy reminding everyone of that.
Children in ancient Greece didn't really have a concept of childhood the way we do now. Life was preparation. Boys trained to be citizens or soldiers, girls trained to be wives and mothers. Toys existed, sure, little clay dolls, spinning tops, but expectations arrived early, very early. Education depended heavily on class and location. In Athens, wealthy boys learned reading, writing, music, poetry, and gymnastics, not because they wanted well-rounded people, but because these were considered essential for participating in public life. You couldn't argue politics properly if you didn't know your Homer. Poorer children learned trades from their parents. There was no universal education system. Knowledge was a privilege, and if you were enslaved, education happened only if it benefited your owner. Yes, slavery. We should talk about that. Ancient Greece ran on enslaved labor. Slaves worked farms, households, mines, workshops. They were prisoners of war, victims of piracy, or people born into slavery. Their lives varied wildly depending on where they were and who owned them. Some had relatively stable lives, others worked in brutal conditions, especially in mines where survival rates were not great. Greek philosophers loved talking about freedom while enslaving people. The irony was not lost on everyone, but it also wasn't enough to change much. Slavery was considered a natural part of the world order. Questioning it would have been inconvenient. Religion, meanwhile, was woven into everything. Greeks didn't really separate religion from daily life. The gods were everywhere, in your home, in your city, watching, judging, possibly planning to ruin your crops because you forgot a sacrifice. The Greek gods were not comforting figures. They were powerful, petty, emotional, and extremely involved in human affairs. You didn't worship them because they were good, you worshipped them because ignoring them was dangerous. Festivals were common and loud and involved a lot of food, wine, and processions. The Olympics, for example, weren't just sports, they were religious events honoring Zeus. Athletes competed nude because, of course they did. Modesty was not the vibe. Death, too, was a constant presence. Life expectancy was low, especially for children. Illness, accidents, and childbirth were serious risks. Funerary rituals mattered deeply because an improperly buried soul was believed to wander, and no one wanted that, especially not haunting relatives who were already stressed. Despite all this, people still laughed. They told jokes, they gossiped, they complained about politicians, they fell in love, had affairs, held grudges, and worried about money. Ancient Greece wasn't a distant, alien world. It was familiar, in a quiet, slightly uncomfortable way. And as we gently drift onward, just remember, beneath the marble statues and philosophy quotes were real people. Tired people, complicated people, people doing their best with the information and gods they had. Let's float onward, shall we, into more Greek strangeness.
All right, let's ease back in. You're still in ancient Greece. The sun is warm, the sandals are uncomfortable, and somehow, despite everything we've already covered, people still found time to relax. Or at least their version of relaxing, which usually involved wine, arguing, or both. Because yes, even in a world full of short life expectancy, constant social pressure, and gods who might ruin your life on a whim, the ancient Greeks absolutely believed in leisure. In fact, they kind of invented the idea that free time was important. They even had a word for it. Skole, which is where we get the word school, ironically enough, because nothing says relaxation like homework. For elite Greek men especially, leisure wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing the right kinds of nothing. You weren't supposed to waste your time on manual labor if you could help it. That was for slaves and the lower classes. A respectable man used his free time to think, to talk, to train his body,
and to attend social gatherings where everyone pretended not to be showing off. One of the most iconic leisure activities was the symposium. Now, this sounds very intellectual, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. A symposium was essentially a drinking party. A structured drinking party, yes, but still very much about wine. Men would recline on couches, because sitting upright was for people who worked, and drink wine that was usually diluted with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, which is a fascinating line to draw, honestly. There would be conversation, music, poetry, and sometimes philosophical discussion. Sometimes the philosophy was deep. Sometimes it was just an excuse to sound clever while drunk. There were rules. A host would decide how strong the wine was and how fast people drank. There was often a symposiarch, basically the party manager, because, of course, ancient Greece needed a wine supervisor. Entertainment varied: music from a lyre or flute, poetry recitations, riddles, and occasionally hired performers. Respectable women did not attend these gatherings. The women present were usually courtesans or hetairai, who were educated, socially skilled, and often far more interesting conversationalists than the men. They could sing, debate, and influence powerful people, which again made respectable society deeply uncomfortable. Outside of drinking parties, Greeks also loved sports. Gymnasiums were everywhere. These weren't just places to work out, they were social hubs. Men trained naked because clothing was seen as restrictive, and also because the Greeks had opinions about the human body. Athletics were tied to ideals of balance, discipline, and beauty. A healthy body reflected a healthy mind, or at least that was the theory. In practice, it also meant a lot of competitive flexing, literally. Now let's gently wander into the topic of medicine, because sooner or later in ancient Greece, you were going to need it. Greek medicine was a mix of observation, superstition, and guesswork. The most famous name here is Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. He lived in the 5th century BC and helped shift medicine away from purely supernatural explanations, which was a big deal. Hippocratic medicine focused on the idea of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was all about balance. Illness meant something was out of whack. Treatment involved diet, exercise, rest, and sometimes letting blood. Because if something's wrong, clearly removing fluids will help. Doctors observed symptoms carefully. They kept notes. They tried to predict outcomes. Some treatments probably helped, others definitely did not. Surgery existed, but anesthesia did not. Pain management was minimal. Opium was used sometimes, wine was common, prayer was never far away. Mental health was not really a separate category. Melancholy, for example, was thought to be caused by too much black bile. So, if you were depressed, the solution might be dietary changes, exercise, or a change of environment, or just being told to toughen up. That was also popular. Despite limitations, Greek medicine was surprisingly influential. It emphasized natural causes and careful observation, laying groundwork that would last for centuries. Even when it was wrong in a very confident, systematic way. Now let's talk about art, because ancient Greece loved art. Sculptures, pottery, architecture, all of it carefully designed to reflect ideals of harmony and proportion. Greek statues famously look calm and perfect even when depicting intense moments. This was intentional. Emotional restraint was admired. Even suffering should look composed, which is interesting considering how emotionally chaotic Greek myths are. Homes, meanwhile, were usually simple. Even wealthy houses didn't look impressive from the outside. Privacy mattered. Most activity happened around a central courtyard. light, air, and a bit of calm in a crowded city. Furniture was minimal: beds, stools, storage chests. Comfort existed, but it wasn't the priority. Food was basic for most people: bread, olives, cheese, vegetables, figs. Meat was rare and usually tied to religious sacrifices. Fish was more common near the coast. Spices were limited. Meals were about sustenance, not indulgence. Unless you were rich, then all bets were off. Clothing was simple too: tunics, cloaks, sandals. Fashion was less about change and more about status. Quality of fabric mattered. Color mattered. Purple dye was expensive and associated with wealth. So if you saw someone in purple, you knew they were either important or trying very hard to look like it. Now let's gently circle back to philosophy, because it really was everywhere. Philosophers weren't just thinkers, they were public figures. They taught students, debated rivals, and occasionally annoyed the authorities. Different schools emerged. The Stoics preached emotional control and acceptance. The Epicureans believed pleasure, specifically modest, thoughtful pleasure, was the goal of life. Cynics rejected social conventions entirely. One famous cynic, Diogenes, lived in a barrel and openly mocked powerful people, including Alexander the Great, which somehow worked out for him. Philosophy offered ways to cope with uncertainty, suffering, and the unpredictability of life. In a world without modern medicine, social safety nets, or stable peace, having a framework for understanding existence was comforting. And that's kind of the key thing to remember. Ancient Greek life wasn't glamorous, it wasn't peaceful, but it was deeply thoughtful. People reflected on how to live, how to die, how to behave, and how to make sense of a world that often didn't make sense back. As we slowly drift onward, keep that in mind. Beneath the statues and ruins were people trying to live meaningful lives, or at least lives that didn't anger the gods too much.
All right, let's ease back in again. The crowds are gone now. The music has faded. Stone streets are quiet, and life in ancient Greece continues at a slower pace. Because eventually, everyone aged. Even in a culture obsessed with youth, beauty, and athletic perfection, time still showed up, uninvited, unimpressed. Growing old in ancient Greece was complicated. If you survived childhood, disease, war, and childbirth, aging itself was both respected and feared. Old age could bring honor, wisdom, authority, especially for men. Elders were seen as closer to understanding life, closer to the gods, closer to death, which somehow made them more trustworthy. But aging also meant vulnerability. The body weakened, vision faded, joints stiffened, pain became a constant companion. There were no pensions, no retirement plans, no safety nets. Your security depended on family, children, especially sons, if you had them, and if they cared. Elderly men might continue participating in public life, speaking in assemblies, serving as advisors, telling long stories that everyone politely listened to, because one day that would be them. Elderly women lived quieter lives, often staying within the household, helping raise grandchildren, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. Their work was invisible, their influence quiet, but essential. Now let's talk about illness, because it was constant. Ancient Greek medicine was evolving. Doctors like Hippocrates emphasized observation and natural causes, which was revolutionary and also limited. Disease was still mysterious. Infections spread easily. Wounds became deadly. Childbirth was dangerous, very dangerous.
Doctors believed health depended on balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of anything was bad, except olives. Those were fine. Treatments included diet, exercise, rest, and sometimes surgery, which without anesthesia was an experience. Pain relief was minimal. Opium existed, but knowledge was limited. Suffering was often endured quietly. Mental illness wasn't recognized as such. Depression was melancholy. Anxiety was imbalance. Psychosis was divine influence. Sometimes illness was blamed on gods, sometimes on fate, sometimes on personal failure. None of these explanations helped much, but they gave people something to hold on to. Now let's gently move toward death, because it was never far away. Death was familiar, not shocking. People saw it often. Children died, friends died, neighbors disappeared quietly. When someone died, rituals mattered deeply. The body was washed, anointed, laid out for mourning. Women led the mourning, crying, wailing, expressing grief openly, because this was one of the few times emotional excess was allowed. Burial followed quickly. The soul needed guidance to the underworld. Coins were placed for Charon, the ferryman. Without them, you wandered. Graves were marked simply: names, occasional inscriptions, brief reminders that someone had lived. The afterlife was not comforting. Most souls drifted in a shadowy existence, neither punished nor rewarded, just present. Only heroes and extraordinary figures received something more, which reinforced the obsession with legacy: be remembered or fade. Now let's pause with the elderly again, those who knew death was coming. Old Greeks didn't romanticize aging. They accepted it, complained about it, joked about it. Philosophers debated whether old age was a blessing or a curse. Some argued it brought freedom from passion. Others argued it brought loneliness. Both were correct. As people aged, their world shrank. Friends died, mobility decreased, public roles diminished. Quiet days became common. Sitting in courtyards, watching shadows move, listening to the city from a distance. There's something deeply human here. Across centuries, across cultures. A slow turning inward. Now let's consider something else: legacy. Ancient Greeks were obsessed with it. Children carried names forward. Stories preserved honor. Monuments marked achievement. Even ordinary people wanted to be remembered, by family, by neighbors, by someone. This fear of being forgotten fueled much of Greek culture: writing, philosophy, art, architecture. They were building permanence in a fragile world. As night settles in again, an older man lies awake, listening to his breath, thinking about his life, the choices he made, the arguments he won, the ones he lost. An older woman drifts to sleep, surrounded by memories. Children grown, work done, life lived quietly. The gods are distant tonight. The city is calm. In the next part, we'll step back and look at the contradictions of ancient Greece as a whole, its brilliance, its cruelty, its strange familiarity. For now, rest. Let the night stretch on. Ancient Greece is settling into silence.
All right, let's drift back one last time. The night is still warm. The lamps are low. Ancient Greece is doing what it did best: thinking about itself. Because if there's one thing this civilization loved more than olives, more than arguments, more than gently judging its neighbors, it was contradictions. Ancient Greece was brilliant and unfair, innovative and deeply conservative, obsessed with reason, while fully convinced thunderstorms were personal messages from the gods. They gave the world philosophy,
democracy, theater, science, and mathematics. They also gave us slavery as a normalized institution, extreme inequality, and a political system that worked beautifully for a very small group of people. Athens talked endlessly about freedom while excluding women, foreigners, and enslaved people from that freedom entirely. Sparta preached equality among its citizens while building that equality on relentless violence and oppression. Greeks believed in balance, moderation, harmony, and then wrote stories about gods who absolutely could not control themselves. They admired reason and constantly acted emotionally. They feared hubris and were intensely proud. It's almost comforting. Daily life reflected this tension. People wanted peace, but lived in cities that expected war at any moment. They valued community, but competed relentlessly for status. They celebrated the human form, yet feared aging and weakness. They praised wisdom, yet often ignored it. And through all of this, they kept going, building, arguing, teaching, raising children who would inherit the same pressures. Ancient Greece wasn't a golden age. It was a stressful age, an anxious age, a deeply human age. Philosophy didn't come from comfort. It came from discomfort, from uncertainty, from the need to make sense of a world that felt unpredictable and unfair. Even their gods reflected this: powerful, flawed, emotionally reactive. The Greeks didn't imagine perfect beings watching over them. They imagined beings who made mistakes, just on a cosmic scale. And maybe that made life easier to accept. As centuries passed, city-states rose and fell, wars came and went, empires absorbed Greece into something larger. But daily life, the quiet routines, the worries, the hopes, those stayed familiar. Parents still worried about children, people still feared being forgotten, old age still arrived quietly, festivals still offered brief relief, and somewhere, someone was still lying awake at night, thinking too much. As we gently step away now, imagine the last lamp being blown out, a stone house settling into darkness, the city breathing softly. Ancient Greece doesn't end dramatically. It just fades, layered under Rome, under time, under us. But its people remain recognizable. Their anxieties, their contradictions, their search for meaning. So if tonight your mind feels busy, if thoughts loop quietly, you're in good company. Ancient Greece did it first. And with that, we'll let the past rest. No grand conclusions, no moral lessons, just a long, thoughtful civilization, finally falling asleep. All right, settle back in. If this were ancient Greece, someone nearby would probably tell you not to stretch like that. Stretching at the wrong moment could be a bad omen, and nobody wanted that. Because beneath all the philosophy, logic, and very serious debates about reason, ancient Greece was deeply, profoundly superstitious. Not in a loud way, in a quiet, constant way, the kind that hums in the background of daily life. Greeks didn't separate the rational from the mystical. They layered them. Philosophy on top, superstition underneath, and anxiety holding it all together. Omens were everywhere. Birds flying the wrong direction, dreams that felt too vivid, sneezes at inconvenient times, accidental spills, sudden silence during conversation. All of it meant something, or at least might. Before major decisions, people looked for signs. Should we go to war? Check the omens. Should we marry? Consult the gods. Should we plant now or wait? Better sacrifice something small and see how it goes. This constant interpretation of the world kept everyone alert and mildly on edge. Magic existed too, not the dramatic kind, the small, private kind. Spells were whispered, Amulets were worn. Curses were scratched into lead tablets and buried, quietly, discreetly, very passive-aggressively. If someone wronged you, you didn't confront them. You wrote their name on a tablet, asked a god to deal with it, and went about your day. Ancient conflict resolution was indirect. Love magic was especially popular. People wanted affection, attention, control. Spells to attract lovers, spells to make someone obsessed, spells to stop a rival. None of this was considered strange. It was practical, like emotional outsourcing to the divine. Dreams were taken seriously. They were messages, warnings, guidance. A bad dream could affect your entire day. A good one might bring cautious optimism, but never full confidence. That would be hubris. Even philosophers who doubted myths still paid attention to signs, just in case. Because what if you were wrong? Now let's talk about fear. Not dramatic fear, the quiet kind. Fear of pollution, not dirt, spiritual contamination. Certain acts made you ritually impure. Death, childbirth, bloodshed. If someone died in a house, rituals were needed to cleanse it. If a woman gave birth, she and the household entered a liminal state, neither good nor bad, just sensitive. This fear of pollution reinforced boundaries between life and death, between sacred and ordinary, between order and chaos. And Greeks were very concerned about chaos. The universe, as they saw it, needed balance, and humans were very good at disrupting that balance unintentionally. So they tried to be careful. Careful with words, careful with actions, careful with assumptions. Now let's drift back to the underworld for a moment, because death never fully left the conversation. The Greek underworld wasn't hell, it wasn't heaven either. It was administrative. Souls arrived, were processed, assigned a place. Most wandered the asphodel meadows, neutral, gray, unremarkable. Some were punished, not many, only the truly dramatic offenders, the ones who really annoyed the gods. Some were rewarded, heroes, favorites, but most just existed. This belief shaped how Greeks lived. There was no promise of cosmic justice, no guarantee that suffering would be compensated later. So life mattered intensely, here, now. Which explains the pressure, the ambition, the anxiety. If this was it, you wanted it to mean something. Now let's talk about time, because Greeks experienced it differently. There was no sense of progress like we have now, no belief that things were steadily improving. The past was often seen as better, more heroic, more meaningful. The present was a decline, the future uncertain. This backward-looking mindset made tradition powerful. Change was suspicious. Innovation needed justification. Even new ideas were framed as rediscoveries of old truths, because admitting something was genuinely new felt dangerous. This is why myths mattered so much. They anchored the present to the past, gave context, provided continuity. Now let's gently observe the ordinary person again. A farmer checking the sky, a mother watching her child sleep, a merchant counting coins twice, a young man rehearsing a speech in his head, an older woman tying an amulet around her wrists before bed. None of them feel heroic. They feel familiar. They worry, they hope, they try to avoid mistakes. Ancient Greece wasn't lived at a grand scale. It was lived one careful decision at a time. As night settles again, rituals close the day. Small prayers, simple gestures, acknowledging forces beyond control. Not begging, just acknowledging. And that's the key difference. Greeks didn't expect protection. They hoped for tolerance. Let the gods notice you kindly, or at least not notice you at all. As we let this part fade, imagine the quiet reassurance of routine, the comfort of familiar rituals, the sense that even if the world is unpredictable, you've done what you can. In the next part, we'll look at how ancient Greece slowly unraveled, not dramatically, not all at once, but through exhaustion, ambition, and very human overreach. So stay still, stay calm, and let the old superstitions drift gently into the dark.
All right, we're back again. Everything still looks the same. The stone streets, the temples, the routines. But something is different now. Not obvious, not dramatic, just worn. Because civilizations don't usually collapse in a single moment. They fade. They fray at the edges. They get tired. Ancient Greece didn't end with a grand final scene. No closing monologue, no curtain call. It simply kept going until it couldn't anymore. The cracks began with success, which is usually how it happens. The city-states grew powerful, confident, certain of their own importance. Athens expanded its influence, built an empire disguised as a defensive alliance, collected tribute, spent it on temples, and told itself this was perfectly reasonable. Other cities noticed, and they were not impressed. Sparta, already irritated by existence itself, watched Athens grow richer, louder, and more self-assured. Tension simmered, alliances hardened, everyone felt justified. And eventually, they did what Greek city-states always did. They went to war. The Peloponnesian War wasn't heroic. It was long, messy, exhausting. Decades of fighting, shifting alliances, plagues, starvation, political paranoia. Athens lost not just militarily, but emotionally. The confidence cracked, trust eroded, fear replaced optimism. Democracy became fragile. Leaders rose and fell quickly. Public opinion swung wildly. People who once believed deeply in civic life began to withdraw. Philosophers questioned everything. Ordinary citizens focused on survival. Sparta won and immediately struggled with the responsibilities of victory, because ruling is harder than fighting. Other powers rose. Thebes had its moments, then declined. Macedon watched quietly, patiently. And Greece, divided and exhausted, didn't notice the shift until it was too late. Philip of Macedon reorganized warfare, centralized power, built an army that didn't rely on endlessly debating strategy in public squares. His son, Alexander, would later take Greek culture across the known world. But by then, independent Greece was already slipping away. What's striking isn't the fall, it's the mood. By the later periods, Greek writing changes tone, less confident, more reflective, more tired. Philosophy turns inward, focuses on personal peace rather than civic perfection. How do I live well replaces how do we build the ideal city? That shift tells you everything. People had spent generations trying to fix the world. Now they just wanted to endure it. Daily life continued, markets still opened, children still trained, festivals still happened. But the belief that the system was perfect, that was gone. There's a quiet sadness here, not despair, just acceptance. Greeks didn't panic about decline. They debated it, wrote about it, analyzed it, and then adapted. Under Macedonian and later Roman rule, Greek culture survived. Ideas lived on, language endured, philosophy spread. Political independence faded, but intellectual influence didn't.
which is oddly fitting. Ancient Greece didn't need to rule forever. It needed to be remembered. And it was. As we sit here now, in the long quiet after everything, imagine the last generations of independent Greeks. People who still walked the same streets, visited the same temples, argued the same arguments, but without the certainty their ancestors had. They lived in the aftermath of greatness, which is a strange place to be. Still proud, still capable, just aware. Aware that nothing lasts, that even the most brilliant ideas belong to their moment. And maybe that knowledge made them gentler, quieter, more focused on the small things. As night falls one more time, the city rests. Not defeated, not erased, just complete. In the next and final part, we'll step fully away, looking at what ancient Greece leaves behind, not as a lesson, not as a warning, just as a human story. So stay still, let the centuries settle. We're almost at the end now.
All right, welcome back. This is the last stretch now. No sudden endings, no dramatic conclusions, just a slow easing out. Ancient Greece has already faded by this point, not erased, just layered over. New rulers, new borders, new accents echoing through old streets. But the stones are still there, the habits too, the way people think, the way they worry. Because civilizations don't vanish cleanly, they leave residue. Greek cities under Macedonian and Roman rule kept living. Markets opened, children learned letters, teachers quoted Homer like he'd never gone out of style, because he hadn't. Philosophy didn't stop. It softened. The big political dreams, the perfect city, the ideal citizen, those quieted down. In their place came something gentler, more personal. How do I live? How do I stay calm? How do I accept what I can't control? Stoics answered one way, Epicureans another. Skeptics shrugged and said certainty was overrated anyway. All of them were tired, in a thoughtful way. This was Greece after ambition burned itself out. Still intelligent, still articulate, just humbler. And honestly, maybe wiser. Greek households still looked familiar. Courtyards, oil lamps, simple meals, arguments over nothing. Parents still worried about children, children still disappointed parents. Nothing revolutionary there. Religion changed slowly. Gods became more symbolic, less personal. Ritual remained, but belief softened. People still made offerings, still whispered prayers, but maybe with less certainty anyone was listening, which is a very human evolution. Now let's step even further back, past individual lives, past city-states. What ancient Greece really leaves behind isn't marble ruins or statues, it's habits of thought. The habit of asking why, of arguing respectfully, or at least passionately, of believing that ideas mattered. Also the habit of overthinking everything. That one stuck around. Greek contradictions carried forward too. Reason mixed with superstition, logic alongside anxiety, confidence paired with self-doubt. You can trace that line straight through Western history. The Greeks didn't solve human nature, they documented it, and that's why they feel so familiar. They worried about decline, about youth being worse than before, about society falling apart, about tradition being lost. Every generation does this. The Greeks just wrote it down first. They also argued about education, about morality, about leadership. They complained about politicians, distrusted demagogues, feared tyranny, and still sometimes invited it in anyway. Again, very familiar. Ancient Greece wasn't wise because it avoided mistakes. It was wise because it noticed them,
repeated them, and then talked about them endlessly. Even now, centuries later, we still borrow their language to describe our problems: democracy, ethics, politics, tragedy. We're still using their words to understand ourselves. And maybe that's the most quietly impressive thing of all. As we let the image dissolve completely now, there's no single moment where Greece ends, no final sunset, no empty streets, just a gradual blending. Greek teachers instruct Roman students, Greek doctors treat foreign patients, Greek ideas migrate into new minds. Ancient Greece doesn't disappear, it diffuses. Which feels appropriate, because this civilization never wanted a clean ending. It wanted continuation, dialogue, response. And here we are, still responding. So, as we finish this long, gentle walk through ancient Greek life, there's nothing you need to take away. No lesson, no call to action, no moral. Just the quiet comfort of knowing that thousands of years ago, people lay awake at night thinking too much. About life, about meaning, about whether they were doing enough. And somehow, that turned into philosophy. The lamps are out now, the streets are silent, the arguments have finally paused. Ancient Greece is asleep, and you can be too. Good night.
All right. If you're still here, that's kind of impressive. Or you've been asleep for a while and this is just drifting past your years. Either way, welcome to the very end. Ancient Greece, by now, is no longer a place you could walk through. It's not a city, not a collection of temples or streets. It's a mood, a low, persistent hum in the background of history. By this point, Greece exists mostly in memory, in classrooms, in footnotes, in half-remembered quotes that get attributed to Socrates, whether he said them or not, which, honestly, he probably didn't. But the Greeks wouldn't mind. They were used to being misquoted. They argued about interpretations constantly, even while alive. What lingers longest isn't the wars or the politics. It's the texture of life, the way people gathered, the way they talked themselves in circles, the way they tried, earnestly, anxiously, to understand what it meant to be human. Ancient Greece didn't give us certainty, it gave us questions, and then more questions about those questions. Even after Greece became a province, a concept, a cultural inheritance, Greek ways of thinking quietly shaped everything around them. Roman elites learned Greek as a mark of education. They studied Greek philosophy to learn how to cope with power, loss, and boredom, which tells you a lot about Roman life, actually. Later scholars copied Greek texts obsessively, sometimes incorrectly, sometimes creatively, but always with reverence, because Greek thinkers felt relatable, fallible, human. They weren't prophets, they were stressed men in cloaks trying to explain existence between meals. That relatability is why they endured. And yet, it's worth remembering how small their world really was. No global perspective, no modern science, no guaranteed tomorrow would look like today. They stood at the edge of the unknown constantly, surrounded by uncertainty, and responded by thinking harder. Sometimes that thinking produced brilliance, sometimes it produced nonsense, often both at the same time, but it filled the silence. If you listen closely now, really closely, you can almost hear it, a distant argument drifting across centuries, someone insisting they finally figured it out, someone else calmly pointing out why they haven't. That sound never stops. It just changes accents. Ancient Greece didn't teach humanity how to be perfect. It taught humanity how to sit with imperfection, to analyze it, debate it, live with it.
and then write about it so future generations could do the same. Which brings us, quietly, to now. You listening, half awake, mind drifting, thoughts looping gently. You're doing something very Greek at the moment, thinking without urgency, letting ideas pass through, not demanding answers, just being. So, there's nothing left to add. No final wisdom, no closing argument. Ancient Greece wouldn't want one anyway. They'd immediately argue with it. Instead, we'll let the conversation trail off naturally, like it always did. A pause, a breath, a comfortable silence. The lamps are out, the thinkers are finally quiet, even the gods have stopped watching, and history, for once, is at rest. Sleep well.
All right, just one more slow drift. Think of this as the very end of the conversation, not a conclusion. More like the moment after everyone has stopped talking, but no one's quite stood up yet. Ancient Greece is very good at that moment. By now, the famous names are gone. No philosophers pacing, no generals planning, no playwrights waiting nervously for applause. What's left are the people who never made it into books, which is most of them. The potter who woke up every day with clay already under his nails. The farmer who checked the sky more often than the gods. The woman who managed an entire household and was remembered only as someone's wife. The child who never reached adulthood and left no trace at all. They lived in the same world, walked the same streets, felt the same worries settle in their chest at night. History rarely lingers on them. But this is where life actually happened. Morning routines didn't change much across centuries. Light through doorways, dust in the air, someone sweeping a courtyard that would be dusty again by noon, someone else already tired. There's comfort in repetition, even when life is hard. Greek daily life wasn't heroic, it was habitual. People rose, worked, talked, ate, complained, rested, over and over again. And while philosophers debated the nature of virtue, ordinary people practiced it quietly, showing up, enduring, taking care of what was in front of them. Most Greeks never traveled far. Their entire universe fit inside a city and its fields, the sea if they were lucky, the mountains if they weren't. Foreign lands were ideas more than places, rumors, stories, threats. So meaning had to be found locally, in family, in work, in ritual, in surviving another year. There's something deeply calming about that scale of life, limited, grounded, unimpressed by grand narratives. And maybe that's why ancient Greece feels restful when stripped of its drama. Once you remove the speeches and statues, it becomes very quiet. Imagine a late afternoon, not festival time, not wartime, just an ordinary day. A woman spins wool slowly, rhythmically. A child traces shapes in the dust with a stick. Someone hums without realizing it. Nothing important is happening, and that's the point. The Greeks didn't document this silence, but it existed, constantly, between arguments, between wars, between generations. This is where life lived. As time passed, these quiet moments stacked up, centuries of small, forgettable days, each one complete in itself. Empires rose overhead, borders shifted, languages blended, but someone still baked bread in the same way, still muttered about the weather, still hoped the gods would stay out of their business. The past doesn't vanish, it dissolves into habit. That's how ancient Greece truly ended, not with conquest, but with continuity. Greek ideas flowed into Roman systems into later worlds, but the emotional core stayed familiar. Worry, hope, routine, rest. If ancient Greece could give advice,
which it absolutely would unprompted, it might say this: don't expect clarity. Don't wait for resolution. Life doesn't work like that. Instead, live. Think a little. Argue occasionally. Care for what's near. Then rest. And that's where we are now. Nothing left to explain. Nothing left to analyze. No more meaning to extract. Just the soft awareness that long before us, people lay down at the end of the day and felt the same tired calm, the same quiet relief when thinking finally slowed, the same acceptance that tomorrow would come, whether they were ready or not. Ancient Greece understood that feeling. And now, so do you. Let the last thoughts drift away. Let the echoes fade. There's no need to stay awake anymore.
All right. If this part exists, it's only because time kept moving, which, honestly, ancient Greece would appreciate. They loved the idea of continuity, even when nothing in particular was happening. By now, we're past history, past legacy, past interpretation. We're in that soft, hazy space where the mind drifts without purpose, the place ancient Greeks reached late at night, when even philosophy felt like too much effort. This is where thinking stopped being productive and started being background noise. Ancient Greeks didn't always reflect deeply. Sometimes they were just tired. Tired of arguments, tired of politics, tired of trying to live correctly. Some nights, a person in ancient Greece didn't care about virtue or balance or the nature of the soul. They cared about getting comfortable on a hard surface and hoping tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. Those nights never made it into texts. No one wrote treatises about quiet exhaustion. No plays were staged about ordinary relief. But those nights existed more often than anything else. A man comes home late from the fields, doesn't speak much, eats slowly, listens to the sound of someone else breathing nearby. A woman finishes the last task of the day, sits down, does nothing for a moment, which feels luxurious. A child falls asleep mid-sentence. No meaning is extracted from these moments, no lesson drawn. They don't need one. This is life when it isn't trying to explain itself. Ancient Greece wasn't constantly brilliant. It was mostly quiet, mostly repetitive, mostly ordinary. And maybe that's the most accurate version of it. Over centuries, those ordinary moments outweighed the famous ones by an overwhelming margin. More meals than speeches, more sighs than debates, more sleep than philosophy. History just doesn't like to admit that. If you could walk through ancient Greece now, not the ruins, but the living city, you wouldn't hear grand ideas echoing through the streets. You'd hear footsteps, fabric shifting, someone coughing, a door closing gently. That's the sound of a civilization existing. And eventually, even that fades. Not erased, just absorbed. The people are gone, the streets are quiet, the questions remain, but softer now. They don't demand answers. They just sit there, like thoughts right before sleep. So this is the end beyond the end, the last light going out, not ceremoniously, just naturally. Ancient Greece doesn't need another word. It's already said enough. And you don't need to stay awake for this part. You can let it pass you by. Nothing important is happening anymore, which means everything is finally at rest. All right, this really is the last one. Not because there's nothing left to say, there's always something left to say, but because eventually no one feels like saying it anymore. Ancient Greece, at this point, is barely a thought, more like a feeling you can't quite place, a familiarity without context, a calm you don't remember earning.
This is what happens after history finishes echoing. The arguments are gone now. Not resolved, just abandoned. Mid-sentence, mid-thought. Somewhere, long ago, someone was about to make a point. They raised a finger, opened their mouth, and then life happened. Dinner needed cooking. Someone knocked. The moment passed. That's how most ideas ended. Ancient Greece wasn't built on constant insight. It was built on interruption. People meant to think deeply. Often they were just distracted, hungry, tired, pulled back into ordinary life. And that's okay. The past doesn't demand your attention forever. It's patient. It waits quietly until you're ready to forget it again. If you could peel back everything now, the stories, the monuments, the interpretations, you'd find something very simple underneath. People trying to get through the day without making things worse. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they absolutely did not. But in the end, it all evens out. The brilliance and the mistakes settle into the same quiet dust. Ancient Greece isn't watching anymore. It's not judging, it's not teaching, it's resting. And that means you can too. There's no final takeaway hiding here, no secret meaning waiting to be discovered at the very bottom. The Greeks would have laughed at the idea anyway, and then argued about it for 6 hours. Instead, there's just this: a slow breath out, a soft quiet, the feeling of something ancient finally letting go. If thoughts still drift through your mind, let them. They don't need answers tonight. They can line up and fade one by one, like footsteps growing distant, like lamps going dark across a city that's done for the day. Ancient Greece has gone as far as it needs to go, and you don't need to follow it anymore. Nothing else is expected of you. Not thinking, not remembering, not understanding. Just rest.
All right. If you're hearing this, time has become very soft. This part isn't history anymore. It's just the atmosphere left behind after history steps out of the room and quietly closes the door. Ancient Greece, at this point, isn't a civilization. It's a weightless impression, like remembering a place you once lived but can't picture clearly. You don't remember names. You don't remember dates. You just remember how it felt. Warm stone under bare feet, dry air, the faint smell of oil and dust, voices nearby not saying anything important. This is what survives longest. Not achievements, not failures, sensations. People often imagine the past as busy, full of action, constant movement, but most of the time it wasn't. Most of the time, ancient Greece was waiting for crops to grow, waiting for news, waiting for heat to pass, waiting for someone else to decide something. Waiting is deeply unrecordable, so it vanishes first. Think of a random afternoon. No festival, no war, no speeches. Someone leans against a wall because standing is easier than thinking. Someone else counts nothing in particular. A breeze moves through a doorway and then leaves. That was ancient Greece too. It's strange how much effort we put into preserving moments that weren't very common, and how easily we forget the ones that were. The Greeks themselves probably didn't think they were living in ancient Greece. They were just living, occasionally annoyed, occasionally content, often tired. They didn't know they'd be studied. They didn't know they'd be quoted. They didn't know statues would outlast their names. They worried about weather, about food, about whether tomorrow would be manageable, which makes them feel very close,
even now. At some point, memory stops organizing itself. Events blur, stories flatten. What's left isn't narrative, it's rhythm. Day, night, day again. Ancient Greece followed that rhythm for centuries and then quietly handed it off. No announcement, no ending, just continuation. That's why this feels like it keeps going, because that's how it actually ended, not with a full stop, with a long ellipsis. So we'll sit here for a moment longer, not doing anything with the past, not asking anything of it, just letting it be what it is now. Very distant, very quiet, very done. If your thoughts are still drifting, that's fine. They don't need direction. They'll slow down on their own. Nothing is happening anymore. Nothing is expected. Nothing is unresolved. Ancient Greece has become what all pasts become in the end: background silence. And silence doesn't need commentary. So we'll stop here, not because there's nothing left, but because there's nothing left that needs words. Rest now. Everything ancient is finally still. All right, we've drifted so far now that even time feels optional. This part isn't really about ancient Greece anymore. It's about what happens when a place, a people, and 1,000 years of thought finally stop asking to be remembered. Ancient Greece, at the very end of its long echo, doesn't feel ancient. It feels neutral, like background air. No voices, no arguments, no need to explain anything. Just the sense that something once existed here and now doesn't require attention. The philosophers are gone. Not dramatically. They didn't vanish mid-sentence. They just stopped being quoted. Their words settled into libraries, then into habits of thinking, then into assumptions no one remembers learning. At some point, nobody even says this comes from Greece. It's just how things are. That's when a civilization truly dissolves. The same happens to daily life. The courtyard is empty now. Not abandoned, just unused. The stone is worn smooth, not by greatness, but by feet that passed over it every day without thinking. Someone once sat here and felt tired. Someone else stood here and waited for nothing in particular. Those moments didn't leave marks. They didn't need to. They were complete when they happened. This is the strange mercy of time. It erases urgency. Everything that once felt vital, honor, legacy, reputation, being remembered, eventually relaxes its grip. Even the fear of being forgotten fades, because there's no one left to worry about it. Ancient Greece doesn't care anymore whether we understand it correctly or misunderstand it completely. It doesn't care if we admire it or criticize it or use it as a metaphor. It's done performing. And that's the most peaceful state anything can reach. If there's a lesson here, and there really doesn't need to be, it's that nothing has to stay sharp forever. Ideas dull, stories soften, edges wear down. And that's not failure, that's rest. Think of the very last evening of ancient Greece. Not historically accurate, just emotionally accurate. No banners, no speeches, no sense of finality. Just someone closing a door, someone else lying down, a city breathing slowly. The world continues somewhere else. And ancient Greece, at last, does nothing at all. If your mind is still moving, let it wander without direction. It will slow on its own. There's nowhere else to go, No more parts to reach. History has finished talking, memory has finished replaying, even silence feels complete. So, this is where we leave it. Not with an ending, but with absence. And absence, for once, is gentle. All right. Since we're still here, we might as well settle in. This part doesn't arrive with purpose. It doesn't announce itself. It's the kind of time that stretches when no one is watching the clock. Ancient Greece, far beyond its official ending, becomes something very simple. Not a subject, not a story, just a place where thought slows down. Imagine standing somewhere familiar but empty. Not abandoned, just quiet in the way places get when they've finished being used for the day. A stone bench still warm from the sun. A column casting a long shadow that doesn't seem to belong to anyone anymore. The air doing what air does, without commentary. No one is coming. No one is expected. This is ancient Greece when it has nothing left to prove. The people who once filled these spaces are gone now, but not in a dramatic way. They didn't exit all at once. They drifted, one generation at a time. Someone stopped repairing a wall. Someone else stopped telling a particular story. A ritual was performed one last time, without anyone realizing it was the last. That's how endings actually happen, quietly, unannounced, completely ordinary. And before it faded into this soft background, ancient Greece spent centuries doing very human things. People worried about aging, they worried about being useful, they worried about whether they'd done enough. Older men sat and talked about how things used to be better. Younger people rolled their eyes and said that every generation says that. Both were correct. Time passed anyway. There were afternoons when nothing productive happened at all. Days when someone woke up late, moved slowly, and accomplished very little. Those days mattered just as much as the famous ones, maybe more. Because those were the days when life wasn't trying to impress anyone. Think of a long, quiet stretch of time. No goals, no urgency, just existing inside the day. Ancient Greece had many of those. They simply weren't recorded. Someone leaned against the wall longer than necessary. Someone stared at the ground and followed cracks with their eyes. Someone forgot what they'd been about to say and decided it didn't matter. The past is full of forgotten moments like that, more than anything else. And now, centuries later, that's mostly what remains. Not ideas, not achievements, a mood, a feeling of slowness, of life moving without pressure. If ancient Greece were awake now, it wouldn't lecture, it wouldn't demand admiration, it wouldn't correct your misconceptions. It would probably sit quietly and let you be, because even it is tired of being explained. The stones have heard enough interpretations, the ruins have been photographed from every angle, the texts have been translated, debated, retranslated. What's left is the quiet beneath all of that. The sense that people lived here, that they had thoughts and worries that felt overwhelming at the time, that those worries eventually passed. Everything passes. There's comfort in that if you let it be gentle. So we stay here a bit longer, not to learn anything new, not to reach a conclusion, just to exist in the same unremarkable stillness that most of ancient Greece existed in for most of its life. No kings shouting orders, no philosophers demanding definitions, no crowds, just space, time, breath. If your mind wanders, let it. If it slows, even better. This part doesn't need attention. It doesn't need to be remembered. It doesn't even need to finish. Like ancient Greece itself at the very end, it simply continues being quiet until you're ready to drift away from it. And whenever that happens, that's enough. No ending required. Just rest. All right. We're still drifting. At this point, even staying feels optional, like leaning against a doorway with no reason to move, no reason not to. Ancient Greece has fully relaxed now. It isn't holding a pose. It isn't trying to be remembered correctly. It's just present in the softest possible way. This is the version of the past that exists when no one is studying it. No timelines, no categories, no footnotes hovering in the background. Just the sense of a place that once had a weight and now feels very light. If you listen closely, and there's no need to, you might imagine the faint sounds of ordinary life continuing long after history stopped caring. A broom dragged lazily across stone, footsteps that don't echo because no one is paying attention, a voice calling a name that doesn't survive the moment. Not important sounds, just familiar ones. Ancient Greece was mostly built out of those. Most days were not defining days. They were filler days, days between things. Days when nothing went wrong, nothing went right, nothing was resolved. Those days stretched on quietly, and they made up the majority of existence. Someone woke up unsure what day it was. Someone forgot why they were annoyed yesterday. Someone else felt vaguely dissatisfied but couldn't explain why. Very human, very timeless. Even now, centuries later, that emotional texture remains easier to recognize than any great achievement, because it feels like today, or yesterday, or some indistinct afternoon that blends into all the others. Ancient Greece isn't distant in moments like that. It's oddly close, not because of philosophy or democracy or art, but because of boredom, routine, mild, persistent tiredness. That's the real through line of history. People often imagine the past as louder than the present, more dramatic, more intense, but most of the time it was quieter. People adjusted their expectations downward. They learned how much effort to apply to things. They learned when to stop caring. There's wisdom in that, even if no one wrote it down. At some point in ancient Greece, someone realized an argument wasn't worth finishing. They stopped mid-thought, shrugged, moved on. That happened more often than breakthroughs. And now, standing here in this extended calm, we're doing something similar. We're not pushing forward. We're not wrapping up neatly. We're just letting things be incomplete. The Greeks would have understood that. They left plenty unfinished. Plays with missing endings, statues never fully polished, buildings repaired just enough to keep standing. Life wasn't about perfection. It was about adequacy, and adequacy is very peaceful. So this part doesn't need to add anything. It doesn't need to deepen meaning or clarify themes. It can just sit here, like a late afternoon that stretches longer than expected, like shadows slowly shifting without urgency. If your thoughts are thinning out now, that's exactly right. Ancient Greece has nothing left to say, and neither do you. There's no final image to hold on to, no lesson to carry forward, just the feeling of having lingered long enough that even curiosity has gone quiet. And that's a good place to be. We'll stay here a moment longer, not because we need to, but because we can. And when you drift away from this, whenever that happens, ancient Greece will remain exactly like this, unbothered, unaware, at rest. That's all it ever wanted in the end. Nothing more. Just quiet. All right, we're still here, which means nothing urgent has happened. That feels appropriate. At this point, ancient Greece has faded so far into the background that it's less a place and more a temperature, a calm, a steady, unremarkable stillness. You're no longer standing in ruins. You're not even imagining people. You're just existing near where they once existed. And that's enough. Time in ancient Greece used to move by sundials and shadows, by meals, by fatigue. Now it moves by nothing at all. There's no sense of before or after anymore, just a long, continuous now. This is what happens when history stops trying to matter. The city doesn't hum, it doesn't echo, it barely breathes. Stone sits where stone has always sat. Paths exist without footsteps. Walls keep standing out of habit. Even memory feels tired here. If you try to recall a name, it slips away immediately, not frustratingly, gently, like your mind saying, "That's not necessary right now." And it's right. Ancient Greece doesn't need to be reconstructed. It doesn't need to be admired correctly. It doesn't need to justify its importance. All of that is work, and this place has finished working. Imagine the very end of a long day, not the dramatic end, not collapse, just the moment when you realize you stopped thinking about what you should be doing. That's where we are. The Greeks had moments like this too, after debates ended, after meals were cleared, after the last conversation of the evening faded into nothing. They would sit, or lie down, or stare at the dark. No philosophy, no reflection, just being tired enough to let the world continue without supervision. Those moments didn't feel historic, they felt ordinary, which is why they're the most honest ones. Ancient Greece, stripped of identity and achievement, becomes very relatable, a place full of people who eventually wanted quiet, who eventually wanted things to stop asking questions, who eventually wanted rest. And now, centuries later, that desire has finally been granted. There's nothing left here that demands attention. Even curiosity has slowed to a polite pause. If your thoughts are drifting apart now, loosening, spacing out, losing their edges, that's exactly the right response. This part doesn't reward focus, it rewards letting go. Nothing important will happen if you stop listening. Nothing will be missed. Ancient Greece isn't going anywhere. It's already gone everywhere it needed to go. All that remains is this soft, unclaimed stillness. No expectations, no conclusions, no endings. Just time taking a break. And you can too. Stay as long as you like. Leave whenever you want. The past won't notice. It's finally asleep. All right. We've drifted into the kind of quiet that doesn't even feel intentional anymore. This is the space where nothing is being held together. No narrative threads, no expectations that something meaningful should happen next. Ancient Greece is no longer a subject. It's not even a setting. It's just the absence of motion. If you try to picture it now, the image doesn't sharpen. It softens. Edges blur. Details decide they don't want to participate. That's fine. That's correct. There's no reason to remember streets or temples or names. They've all relaxed into the same gentle haze.
Time here doesn't pass. It also doesn't stop. It just doesn't bother. This is what comes after centuries of significance, after being quoted, examined, argued over, and summarized. Everything eventually reaches a point where it's allowed to be quiet. Imagine a place long after the last person has left it for the night. Not abandoned forever, just unattended. A cup left where it was set down, a door not fully closed, the faint sense that someone was here once, but not recently. Ancient Greece feels like that now. No one is maintaining it. No one is interpreting it. No one is asking it to explain itself. It exists in a state of complete non-participation. And that's deeply restful. The people who lived here would recognize this moment. They had it too, in small ways. That feeling when the day is over and there's no more usefulness required of you. No one needs your opinion. No one needs your effort. No one is waiting on your decision. You're done. Those moments didn't feel important when they happened. They weren't written down. They weren't discussed later, but they were real. And they mattered in the only way that really counts. They allowed the mind to stop working. Now, all of ancient Greece exists inside that feeling, a civilization-sized exhale. Nothing more needs to be said. Nothing more needs to be understood. If thoughts still drift by, let them pass without grabbing on. They'll fade on their own. This part isn't going anywhere. It doesn't lead forward. It doesn't circle back. It just rests. Like a place that has finally stopped being visited. Like a memory that no longer insists on being recalled. Ancient Greece isn't waiting for us. It's not listening. It's not aware. And that's the most peaceful ending it could have. So we'll stay here for a little while longer. Not because we need to, but because nothing is pushing us away. And when you drift off, whether it's now or later, this quiet will remain exactly as it is, unchanged, unbothered, at ease. Nothing else is required. All right. We've reached the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like it belongs to any place at all. Not ancient Greece, not the present, not memory. Just quiet. At this point, time has stopped keeping count. Not dramatically. It didn't announce its resignation. It simply wandered off and forgot to come back. Ancient Greece, once so carefully measured in eras and periods and styles, has finally slipped free of all of that. No archaic, no classical, no Hellenistic. Just a long, even stretch of nothing in particular. If you try to imagine a moment here, it doesn't land on anything specific. There's no scene to hold, no image to focus on, only the feeling of space being comfortable. This is what happens after everything that needed to happen has already happened. The stones don't feel ancient anymore. They don't feel ruined. They just feel present. Not asking to be understood, not offering symbolism, not reminding you of what once stood here. They're done carrying meaning. The people are gone too, but not in a sad way, not in a dramatic, tragic way, more like the way a room feels after everyone has gone to sleep. The energy lingers, but no one is using it. Ancient Greece spent thousands of years being awake in our minds, being analyzed, being admired, being blamed. And now it's finally allowed to do what it never got to do while it existed. Nothing. No progress, no decline, no legacy management. Just rest. The Greeks themselves would have appreciated this state. They understood the value of pause, even if they rarely practiced it long enough. They knew the danger of excess.
They warned against imbalance. They talked endlessly about moderation. And yet, they rarely stopped. Now, finally, they have. This is the version of ancient Greece that isn't teaching, isn't inspiring, isn't cautionary. It's just quiet enough to blend into the background of your thoughts. If you notice your mind drifting farther away now, that's natural. There's nothing left here to hold on to. No tension, no curiosity, no loose ends. This part doesn't conclude anything. It doesn't wrap up themes or deliver meaning. It simply stays still until stillness feels complete. And if you fall asleep here, nothing will be interrupted. The past isn't speaking. The present isn't demanding. Everything is evenly, comfortably calm. So we'll let this part stretch on for a moment longer, not because it needs to, but because it doesn't need to stop. And when you finally drift away, when thought thins out and awareness softens, this quiet will remain exactly the same. Ancient Greece won't notice, time won't object, nothing will change. And that's exactly how it should be. All right, we'll slow this down even more. 10 minutes is a long time when nothing needs to happen. So we'll let it stretch. We won't fill it aggressively. We'll let the quiet do most of the work. Ancient Greece at this stage isn't even resting anymore. Rest implies effort came before it. This is beyond that. This is when the idea of effort itself dissolves. Always remember, most of ancient Greece felt like this. Not statues, not speeches, not history class moments, just time passing without commentary. People waking up without enthusiasm, people sitting without purpose, people lying down because it felt better than standing. That was the majority experience. Always remember, the famous parts were interruptions, the wars, the debates, the dramas. They were loud moments layered on top of an otherwise very quiet existence. Most Greeks were not thinking about the future of Western civilization. They were thinking about whether their back hurt, whether it was too hot, whether they could stop working yet. Those thoughts didn't echo forward, but they were real. Imagine a long afternoon where nothing changes. The sun moves slightly, shadows shift almost imperceptibly. Someone sighs, not because they're upset, but because breathing out feels good. No one is keeping track of time. No one is measuring productivity. That's ancient Greece without the spotlight. Always remember, history feels busy because we compress it. We stack centuries into paragraphs. We line events up neatly. But the people inside those centuries experienced them slowly, painfully slowly sometimes, day by day, hour by hour. Waiting was common, boredom was common, fatigue was common, and those things leave a softer imprint than glory. Always remember, most lives don't arc, they drift. Ancient Greek lives drifted too. Children grew up without realizing history was happening around them. Adults aged without noticing the world was changing. Elderly people remembered things differently every year. Change didn't feel dramatic. It felt gradual, almost imaginary. Until one day it was done, and no one noticed the exact moment. That's comforting in a way. There was no final bell, no announcement, just continuation until there wasn't. Ancient Greece didn't collapse emotionally. It thinned out, like sound fading at night, like conversation trailing off when everyone is tired. Always remember, silence isn't empty. It's full of things that no longer need attention. The streets that once echoed with footsteps now hold calm instead. The houses that once held arguments now hold still air. The spaces that once demanded meaning now ask nothing. That's not loss, that's completion. If your mind wanders here, that's good. It means nothing is gripping it. Thoughts can appear and drift away without being finished. That's exactly how the Greeks ended most days. They didn't resolve everything. They didn't understand everything. They slept anyway. Always remember, understanding is optional. Rest is something you don't earn by thinking hard enough. It's something you allow when thinking no longer helps. Ancient Greece eventually allowed itself that luxury. It stopped explaining itself. It stopped defending its importance. It became quiet enough to fade into the background of everything that came after. And now you're sitting in that background. Nothing here requires effort. Nothing here needs interpretation. You don't need to picture ruins. You don't need to imagine people. You can let everything blur into a soft, neutral calm. Like the moment just before sleep, when thoughts lose their edges and stop forming sentences. Always remember, that moment existed then, too. Somewhere in ancient Greece, someone lay down and stopped thinking, and nothing bad happened because of it. The world continued, the sun rose later, life went on. You can do the same now. There's no test, no lesson, no takeaway. Just the permission to stop holding everything together. If awareness fades, let it fade. If sleep arrives, let it arrive. Ancient Greece isn't watching. History isn't grading you. Nothing expects anything more. Always remember, this quiet is allowed, and it will still be here whether you're awake for it or not.
All right, we'll stay with it. There's no reason to rush this part. Nothing waiting on the other side of it. Nothing keeping score. This is the kind of long that doesn't need filling. It just needs space. Ancient Greece by now has thinned into something almost weightless. Not erased, not gone, just no longer insisting on being noticed. If you try to picture it, you might notice the image refuses to settle. Columns blur into light, streets soften into suggestion, even the sky feels unfinished. That's fine. That's where we're meant to be. Because most of the past was lived without clarity, without sharp outlines, without knowing what it would become. Ancient Greeks didn't experience their lives as ancient, they experienced them as ongoing. They didn't wake up thinking about legacy. They woke up thinking about stiffness in their joints, about heat, about whether today would be easier than yesterday. Sometimes it was, often it wasn't. But it passed anyway. Always remember, time didn't feel impressive to them. It felt slow. Hours dragged, afternoons stretched endlessly. Waiting was a skill you learned whether you wanted to or not. Waiting for ships, waiting for seasons, waiting for someone else to make a decision. Waiting quietly reshapes the mind. It teaches you how to sit with unfinished thoughts, how to exist without resolution, how to let discomfort dull into something manageable. Ancient Greece learned that lesson deeply, even if it never wrote it down. Think of a late afternoon with no plans, no responsibilities pressing in, just the awareness that the day will end eventually. The sun lowers without urgency, shadows lengthen without explanation. No one announces the transition, it simply happens.
That's how most change occurred. Not with drama, with gradual acceptance. People aged that way too. One year they were young, then one day they weren't. And there was no clear moment when it happened. Their reflection shifted slowly. Their energy faded quietly. They adjusted, or they complained, or they did both. Life didn't ask for commentary. Ancient Greece was full of these slow adjustments. Cities adapted, customs shifted, beliefs softened. Nothing snapped suddenly. It all eased into something else. And now, here we are, so far past the easing that even the idea of transition feels unnecessary. There's no before left to compare this to, no after waiting to arrive, just this extended pause. Always remember, this pause isn't empty. It's full of everything that no longer needs effort. The urge to understand fades, the need to connect dots loosens. Thoughts appear, but they don't insist on finishing themselves. They drift, like clouds that don't form shapes long enough to name. That's not confusion, that's rest. Ancient Greece spent centuries being sharpened by interpretation. Now it's allowed to blur. The stones no longer carry symbolic weight. The ruins no longer perform. They simply exist as matter, calm, unbothered. If you imagine walking here now, your footsteps wouldn't echo. There's nothing listening. And that's comforting. There's something deeply peaceful about being unobserved, unmeasured, unremembered. Most of the people who lived in ancient Greece lived that way too. They mattered intensely to a few people and not at all to the future. And that was enough. Always remember, being forgotten is not the same as being erased. Those lives were complete when they were lived. They didn't need witnesses centuries later. They laughed, they worried, they rested. That was the whole thing. And now that fullness has settled into stillness. We don't need to add anything to it. We don't need to pull meaning from it. We can just stay here, letting the quiet stretch. 10 minutes, an hour, a vague sense of time that no longer resolves into numbers. Ancient Greece doesn't notice how long we linger. It's not waiting. It's simply finished speaking. If your breathing has slowed, that's good. If your thoughts feel distant, that's good. Nothing is being missed. This part doesn't move toward an ending. It just gently continues until attention drifts away on its own. Like a story no one stops reading, they just fall asleep partway through. And that's the most accurate way to leave ancient Greece. Not with understanding, not with insight, but with a soft, unremarkable quiet that doesn't need to be remembered to be complete. We'll stay here a little longer, not because we need to, but because nothing tells us to stop. And when you drift off, whenever that happens, this calm will still be here, doing nothing, as it should.
All right. We're deep enough now that staying and leaving feel almost identical. That's usually a sign that nothing is pulling at you anymore. Ancient Greece at this point isn't behind us. It isn't ahead of us. It's not even around us. It's dissolved into the same quiet layer that holds old memories, half-dreams, and thoughts you don't finish. If you try to reach for it, there's nothing solid to grab. And that's fine. That's where it's most comfortable. Most of life works this way, honestly. It feels defined while you're in it, sharp-edged, urgent. And then later, it softens. Ancient Greece was once filled with schedules. Markets opened and closed. Ships arrived late. Festivals were planned, postponed, argued about. People worried about missing things. But eventually, that sense of urgency wore down. Not all at once, just slowly, over generations. At some point, there were fewer voices insisting things mattered right now, fewer hands pointing at the future, more people leaning back and letting time pass. You can feel that here. This is a place where nothing is asking to be prioritized. No thoughts demanding completion, no stories demanding closure,
just a gentle permission to stop arranging things in your mind. Ancient Greece has become unorganized on purpose. The order we imposed on it, periods, movements, schools, timelines, has quietly fallen away. What's left isn't chaos, it's ease. Ease is what comes after you stop caring whether things make sense. Imagine sitting somewhere familiar long after you've stopped checking the time. The room is dim, you know you should probably move at some point, but there's no reason to yet, so you don't. That's the feeling ancient Greece settles into now. The past doesn't feel heavy here. It doesn't feel distant either. It just feels inactive. And inactivity is underrated. The Greeks themselves understood that in small doses. They valued leisure, even if they didn't always get much of it. They talked about balance endlessly, even while failing at it. Now, finally, balance has been achieved accidentally. No effort, no philosophy, just stillness winning by default. If you notice your thoughts looping a little, that's fine. Loops don't need exits here. You can think the same thought twice, or not at all. Nothing is being recorded. Ancient Greece isn't being observed anymore, which means you aren't either. There's something deeply restful about that. Most of the people who lived back then disappeared into this same state. Not remembered, not summarized, just done. Their lives weren't incomplete because of that. They were complete because they happened. And now, centuries later, all that completeness has flattened into calm. No pressure, no legacy, just the quiet fact that time passed, and then passed some more, and then stopped needing to be noticed. We can sit with that for a while. There's no correct way to experience this part. If your mind wanders, let it. If it empties, let it. Ancient Greece isn't offering anything new. It's offering relief from needing anything at all. And eventually, without anyone deciding it, attention will drift elsewhere. Sleep might arrive, or not. Either way, this place will remain unchanged. Still, unconcerned, perfectly finished. We'll linger just a bit longer, not because there's more to say, but because silence, when it's this soft, doesn't mind being shared. All right, this is the last one. Not the dramatic kind of last. No closing credits, no sense of accomplishment. Just the last moment where we stay here together before everything fades on its own. 10 minutes doesn't need to be filled. It just needs to be allowed. Ancient Greece at this point is no longer something you're thinking about. It's something you're resting near. Like a distant shoreline you're not looking at directly. You know it's there. You don't need to check. The mind does this naturally when it's tired enough. It stops organizing, stops labeling. Thoughts arrive slowly, if they arrive at all. That's where ancient Greece finally belongs. Not in timelines, not in lectures, but in that soft mental background where effort is no longer required. Always remember, the people who lived there reached this state every night. After the day's work, after the conversations ran out, after the arguments stopped being interesting, they didn't think of it as peace. They just thought of it as being done for the day. Someone lay down on a simple surface. Someone pulled fabric closer. Someone stared into darkness without expecting insight. No one demanded meaning from the moment. They just let it be quiet. Ancient Greece wasn't constantly wise. It wasn't always poetic. Most of the time, it was practical, tired, and ready to stop. That's the version we're sitting with now. No philosophers pacing, no students taking notes, no one correcting anyone else. Just the after-hours version of a civilization, the one that never makes it into books. If you imagine a city at this hour, There's no movement worth tracking. A door creaks somewhere and then settles. The air cools slightly, nothing follows. Time loosens its grip. Always remember, nothing important is happening right now. And that's not a loss, that's permission. You don't need to understand ancient Greece to be here. You don't need to picture it correctly. You don't need to remember anything that came before this part. Those were optional. This is not. This is where the mind finally gets to stop holding history together. The past doesn't collapse without your attention. It doesn't unravel. It simply rests. Ancient Greece has been resting for a very long time. It doesn't notice when we talk about it, and it won't notice when we stop. That's comforting. Always remember, nothing needs closure tonight. Loose ends don't matter when no one is pulling on them. Unanswered questions soften until they stop asking. The Greeks left plenty unanswered. They were very comfortable with that, even if they argued otherwise. They left ideas unfinished, lives incomplete, projects half done. And then they slept. Anyway. The world didn't fall apart because of it. If your thoughts are slowing now, let them. If they're repeating themselves, that's fine too. Repetition is what happens when the mind is winding down. It's not a mistake, it's a signal. The signal that you don't need to stay alert. Ancient Greece doesn't need your focus. It doesn't need your respect. It doesn't need your curiosity. It already had all of that, and then it let it go. Now it exists in the same way dreams exist just before you fall asleep. Present, but not demanding. If awareness fades in and out here, that's perfect. This part is meant to blur. You don't need to hear every sentence. You don't need to follow every thought. You can drift. Always remember, nothing bad happens when you stop paying attention. Nothing is lost. The past remains the past. The quiet remains quiet. And you're allowed to rest inside it. This is the final stretch, not an ending, just the last gentle moment before everything dissolves into sleep. We won't push it, we won't count it down. We'll just let the silence grow comfortable enough that you forget you were listening at all. Ancient Greece has nothing left to say, and neither do you, which means everything is exactly as it should be. Good night.